whenever someone said, hey, that COVID thing probably started in a lab or might have started in the lab, or someone, speculated that it was, because it's good to ask those questions because they're doing that kind of stuff all the time. They're creating viruses in labs all the time, I guess. Apparently, now we know that they are. It's called gain of function. And so this was from March 31st. This is CNN. If you thought that the COVID-19 originated in a lab, that was like out of a comic book, according to CNN. And they're experts. And you're nuts if you thought that. There's still articles up calling Joe Rogan a conspiracy theorist for saying that there's people speculating that it started in a lab. Well, guess what? Now the Wall Street Journal is adding more fuel to the fire on this lab theory. And now it's okay to question it because the Wall Street Journal says so. So the Wall Street Journal uncovered a previously undisclosed U.S. intelligence report that could add weight to the growing calls for a fuller probe on whether COVID. 3 researchers from China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick enough in November 2019 that they sought hospital care. So there's 3 people working in that lab. They're supposedly all friggin' cooked. They got sick enough from a virus in the same week that they all had to go to hospital. That's the double CK. The details of the reporting go beyond the State Department fact sheet, said the several researchers at the lab. A Center for the Study of Coronaviruses and Other Pathogens became sick in autumn 2019 with symptoms consistent with both COVID-19 and common seasonal illnesses. November 2019 is roughly when many epidemiologists and virologists believe COVID-19, the virus behind the pandemic, first began circulating around the central Chinese city of Wuhan, where Beijing says the first confirmed case was a man who fell ill on December 8th, 2019. The Wuhan Institute hasn't shared raw data, safety logs, and lab records on its extensive work with the coronavirus in bats, which many consider the most likely source of the virus. So now here's someone asking Fauci, the shit libs hero, Fauci, who we showed you is a pathological liar about the coronavirus and the treatment for it. We've showed you that. Here he is now being asked because previously said didn't come from a lab, it came from nature. Now there's
a lot of cloudiness around the origins of COVID-19 still. So I wanted to ask, are you still confident that it developed naturally?
No, actually, I'm not convinced about that. I think that we should continue to investigate what went on in China until we find out, to the best of our ability, exactly what happened.
Huh. According to the National Post, Dr. Fauci's newfound skepticism on COVID-19's natural origin is at odds with his former stance on the issue. Not only that, it's at odds with the whole media's entire stance on it. Everybody said if you even brought that question up, you were a conspiracy theorist. By the way, that's not how fucking science works. Here's Paul Graham points out some of the stealth edits that Vox did a debunking the conspiracy of the Wuhan lab theory of COVID-19. And then guess what? After it's been now proven it probably did come from the lab, now after people risked their lives and stuck their necks out to tell the truth about it, after people have been censored, have been canceled, have been silenced over this, now Vox comes back to do a deceptive edit. So you see what they did? It said the Wuhan Institute of Virology is a real place, and the exact origin of the novel coronavirus is still a mystery, with the researchers racing since the outbreak began to figure it out. But already virologists who've parsed the genome and infectious disease experts who study coronavirus have more than enough evidence to show that the virus is brand new and came from nature, not the Wuhan lab. They changed it. Now it says that coronaviruses say they have enough, not more than enough evidence that the virus came from the nature, not the Wuhan lab. They took that out. So they're changing. That's 9 words difference. Here's a 41-word difference. There appears to be it. So and as Shant Mesrobian points out, Vox, a science-worshipping explanatory news site, told us that COVID wouldn't become a pandemic. They were wrong. Told us masks don't work. They were wrong. Travel restrictions don't work. They were wrong. And that the lab leak theory is a debunked conspiracy theory. They were wrong. This website should be out of business. If I made that many mistakes about the coronavirus on my YouTube show, YouTube would have taken down my videos and shut my channel down. but Vox and every other shit journalist out there gets to fucking lie to you and tell you misinformation as if it's fact. And now let me bring it. Well, this brings me to this article on Substack by Matt Taibi. He says fact-checking takes another beating. And there he is. There's Dr. Fauci, who we've shown is a proven liar about COVID. He's not misunderstanding the facts. He's not changing his opinions when the facts change. He lies about COVID whenever he feels like it. And so this is from Matt Taibbi. He says, through 2020, officials and mainstream press shut down most every discussion on that score about where the originated the COVID virus. Did it come from a lab? It got shut down in 2020. The consensus was so strong that some well-known voices saw social media accounts suspended or closed for speculating about COVID-19 having a lab origin. Just days after its festival of fact-checking, PolitiFact had to issue a correction to its September 2020 pants on fire ruling on the lab origin theory. And here it is. PolitiFact did a fact check, and they said the idea that the COVID-19 originated in a lab was pants on fire, conspiracy shit, crazy. They have fact in their name, PolitiFact. That was not a fact. That was a theory that they were positing as fact to discredit people who had questions about the establishment narrative. That's what PolitiFact is. They're the establishment narrative. They are not a fact-checking organization by any means. And this proves it. And so now this is what they put up now. Archived fact check. Tucker Carlson guest airs debunked conspiracy theory that COVID-19 was created in a lab. Editor's note, when this was fact checked, it was first published in September. PolitiFact sources included researchers who asserted that the SARS-CoV-2 virus could not have been manipulated. That assertion is now more widely disputed. For that reason, we are removing this fact check from our database pending a more thorough review. So that's not a fact check. That's you pushing establishment narrative as a fact. And anyone else who doesn't repeat the establishment narrative is now given a scarlet letter and canceled from society. That's what PolitiFact does. And then when they get it 100% wrong, they're not going to get their Twitter account suspended. They're not going to get their Facebook page. There's not going to come a warning when they tweet something. Hey, they get shit wrong all the time on COVID. Nothing's going to happen because they lie in the same way the establishment is lying. Now, let me bring in Matt Taibbi, who wrote this article on this. Our guest is one of the top journalists of his generation. He's a contributing editor at the Rolling Stone magazine. He's the author of the best-selling books Griftopia, The Great Derangement, and most recently, Hate Inc. You can read his writings along with this article at taibi.substack.com. Please welcome Matt Taibbi. Hi, Matt.
How's it going, Jimmy?
Matt, it is unbelievable what's happening.
It is.
Well, so I've made this point before. Why is it okay now to disagree with the CDC? Why is it okay now to question the coronavirus origin? Why is it okay? Before, if you did any of that stuff, you got canceled. I'm not kidding. Well, let me just throw that to you and you can answer.
Well, I think originally what happened with this story was that, like almost everything else in the Trump era, the coverage of COVID was heavily politicized from the very start. And the idea of a lab origin for COVID was associated with Trump. It was associated with Mike Pompeo. It was associated with Tom Cotton. So it was automatically bad. It was automatically a conspiracy theory. And that's really how the press treated it for the better part of a year. And then I think what happened was the WHO delegation went to visit China a couple of months ago. They came back with a few questions, and they slowly are now trying to roll out a theory that we have to now investigate a lab origin hypothesis. And this is how they're doing it. They're basically saying, oh, yeah, we may have screwed this up.
And so what does this tell you about journalism? What it tells me is that, again, there's just a herd mentality of a bunch of spineless cowards who will push a false narrative and let other people get thrown under the bus who are doing good work. What does it tell you about journalism?
Yeah, this is a classic screw up of journalism, because COVID is it's the kind of story that sort of reveals the core truth about the journalism business, which is that we basically don't know anything. Like we're not experts. We know at best a lot of us went to journalism school, and what did we study? Journalism, which isn't anything. So when we get presented with a story like this, which is highly technical and extremely complicated in the best circumstance, we're completely dependent upon experts, and we're only telling you our best guess about what could possibly be true. And so the worst thing you can possibly do at the start of a story like this is instantly start ruling things out and declaring some things facts and some things conspiracy theories, and on top of that being sanctimonious and obnoxious about it. You have to have some humility with the job of journalism. I think that's actually crucial to how you do this job. Is you have to know that you don't know anything, and you have to be suspicious of everybody that you talk to, and over time things get revealed, and that's how you get to a truth. They did it backwards with this story. They declared a truth at the start, and now they're in this backpedal mode which is a complete catastrophe for the business and for the country.
Yeah, they. I can't get over the lack of intellectual curiosity that is allowed in journalism today. Anybody who has a question that questions any establishment narrative, you are immediately branded a kook and a crazy. Like I was telling people, all I did was share the effects that I've gotten from my second vax. I've gotten both the vaxes, and so I shared the side effects that I'm having, and people called me anti-vax. What the fuck? I mean, that's
right.
Part of that same thing. That's part of the you're going outside the. Chomsky talked about this in Manufacturing Consent, that what the news media is there really to do, and what the media is there to do is to set the parameters of the debate. And if you go outside that parameter, you are then labeled a bad person. You are unclean. You're you're the worst thing. Why is that?
Well, look, that's by design, and in his book Manufacturing Consent, he kind of lays out how the business works. If you have intellectual curiosity, if you're the kind of person who is inclined to have an original thought, you just don't get promoted in journalism. That's the way it works. All those personalities, they wash out of the business relatively quickly. You see it happen to people like Chris Hedges, for example, right? Like he has the wrong opinion on whatever it is, Iraq or Bosnia or whatever, and they just quietly move you into a different part of the company, and you stop being on the front page, and before you know it, you're working in, not in the New York Times anymore. And the people who do rise in the business are the people who tend to be conformists, intellectually uncurious, and they have that herd mentality. They don't mind thinking as a group. Whereas this is a job, again, where in order to be really good at it, you have to have the courage to sometimes take an unpopular point of view and say and report something that sounds unlikely, but there's evidence for it. That's the whole point of the job, is you have to have that kind of quality, but they wash that out of you in the business.
And so the least curious amongst us are the people charged with bringing us the news of the day. That's how the filtering, that's how the promotion system works over at the New York Times. The least curious amongst us gets promoted. So I wanted to talk about this idea now that I remember when CNN announced ahead of the campaign, the political season, that they were hooking up with factcheck.org so that they could then fact check politicians' statements. And I'm like, it never dawned on Jake Tapper or anybody at CNN that they're supposed to be a fact-checking, that they have to go find an app to figure out how to fact-check. What does that say about the news media, that they have to team up with an app to do a fact-check?
All of that is just a marketing campaign. Like the journalism business has been having this problem for a long time, where the public has had this declining trust in the news media. They just don't believe what we report anymore. And so as a partial solution to this, as a partial way of dealing with the fact that audiences have begun to clue into the fact that a lot of professional corporate news media is very politicized. They've started dredging out fact-checking operations as a way of saying, look, we're really dedicated to facts. We're really into, factuality in our stories when we can prove it because, look, we have this shiny thing and we even call it fact-checking. Like, we're going to put that on the front page. But actually, you're right. Like, just journalism itself is fact-checking. That's the whole point. You shouldn't need a separate thing to fact-check a politician's statements. That's your job. It's ridiculous. And internally, fact-checking within news organizations has always had a different connotation and a different meaning, and people in the business understand that this whole thing they've been showing to the public is just it's a joke.
So in your article, you make the point that I used to make fun of journalism in this way. I would say that they always go, well, they say this and they say that. Like you'd see Brian Williams would have a debate between an anti-climate change person and a pro-climate change person, and he would say, well, thanks for the debate. Well, this guy says this. I guess we'll never know, And the joke I make is that you couldn't say that about sports. You couldn't report sports like that. You couldn't say the Cubs played the Dodgers. Dodgers said they won 5-4. Cubs said they won 5-4. Who really won? Well, I guess we'll never know. That's not how it works, right? But that's the way they used to do it, and I used to make fun of them for doing it that way. But now they're not doing that anymore. They're not going, well, they say this and they say that. Now they're saying, we fact-check it, and then they got it wrong. Isn't that what's happening now?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, sometimes the way they did that in the past was a total cop-out, and it was a way of allowing illegitimate opinions to get more play than they really should have, because they didn't take a stance and really say what they really felt about a certain issue. Like, they would know that one version is more true than the other, and they just they would allow the illusion that there was some debate about that. In my own work, I always tried to avoid doing that. Like, if I was writing about Goldman Sachs, I would say, this is what I think they did. I would give you the denials. I would give you the other side of the story, but I'd say, this is what I think they did. However, recently there's been this problem where they have stopped doing even the perfunctory, superficial requirement of allowing for some other possibility, and which you do have to do in journalism. You do have to say, look, there still is this possibility that this is true. Like, we don't know absolutely for sure. This person claims this. We have to, out of fairness, we do have to say that there is that possibility. They kind of stopped doing that. And that's how you get the situation like this thing with the lab origin story, where they locked themselves into a version before they knew anything. And that's not a good way of doing the job either.
And the point you make in the article, which is a great point, is that these people are in journalism. They're not scientists. They're not engineers. They're not specialists in any of these things. And these stories have to get printed and put out that day. They don't have time to do this kind of research of fact-checking. And they're taking a shot at the truth. I'm paraphrasing your article.
Absolutely.
And you say, you make a great point. You go, but once you get past names, dates, and whether the sky that day was blue or cloudy, the worst kind of misinformation in journalism is to be too sure about anything. That's especially when dealing with the complex technical issues, and even more especially when official sources seem interested in eliminating discussions of alternative scenarios of those issues. So that's the part that gets me the most. It's like, okay, I don't mind you repeating the government narrative or the establishment narrative. I know you're going to do that. But the fact that you would then shame people who have questions, which is almost the definition of a journalist, is to question the official and establishment narrative about everything. And then you turn doing that into something disgusting and something dirty and something nefarious and something to be shamed. That's the thing that I still can't get over. And I'll just go ahead and comment on it.
Yeah, again, this has been really... A lot of this has to do with politics, especially in the last 5 years, when there's been this sentiment that we saw, among other things in the Trump campaign, journalists are the enemy of the people, this association with being anti-media the press has interpreted that as anybody who criticizes the news media is right-wing, is a lunatic, is a conspiracy theory, and they should be shamed. We're the good people, we're the defenders of democracy, blah, blah, blah. And they've gotten, I think, high on themselves, and they've forgotten what their role in society is, which is, when people don't believe you, it's your fault. like you lost somebody's trust. Like it's not like it was an unfair thing that happened to you. This was a gradual process. It didn't start with Trump. It's been going on for 20 years now, and the business has just been slow to realize that it's out of touch with ordinary people, and ordinary people don't trust them anymore, and so they react in these ways that are defensive, and they're aligning themselves with official sources because they see themselves as being part of that group now, like arrayed against the general public, which is the opposite of what they should be.
So this really is another offshoot of Trump derangement syndrome, is what has happened.
Totally.
So you could not risk being seen on the other side, on the other team, or being a sympathizer, or it's what McCarthyism is. That's what McCarthyism was, and you got afraid to be associated. Were you at a meeting with these people? Have you now, or have you ever been a member of? I mean, that's what this is, and that's what's been going on for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's been cheered on by the worst of it, by the Young Turks, by the Intercept, by the fucking MSNBC and CNN and New York Times, the loudest, and they're all shit. And now when people like me and you, I come along, not you, when I come along and with a YouTube show and start doing better journalism than they do, because how could you do worse? They then start to do bullshit propaganda about how we're the ones misinforming people and creating conspiracy theories when they're the ones doing that. I'm a conspiracy analyst. They're conspiracy theorists at NBC and CNN and the New York Times and the Intercept and the Young Turks. They're conspiracy theorists. I debunk their conspiracies. And so that's it. Well, let's move on to this about the COVID-19. From the start, you say the press mostly mishandled COVID-19 reporting. Part of this was because nearly all of the critical issues, mask use, lockdowns, viability of vaccine programs, and so on, were marketed by news companies as culture war narratives. That's exactly right. If you questioned any part of it, you're a bad person, including lockdowns. Including lockdowns. A related problem had to do with news companies using the misguided notion that the news is an exact science to promote the worst misconception that science is an exact science. This led to absurd spectacles like news agencies trying to cover up or denounce as falsehood the natural reality that officials had evolving views on things like the efficacy of ventilators or mask use, by labeling whatever the current scientific consensus happened to be an immutable fact. So that's what they were doing. Whatever the scientific consensus at that moment was, it still wasn't peer reviewed. It still wasn't set. They were, whatever the scientists' consensus was, they were saying that was fact at the moment when they shouldn't be doing that. And that is journalistic malpractice. And you point that out. By labeling whatever the current scientific consensus happened to be an immutable fact, media outlets made the normal evolution of scientific debate look dishonest and pointlessly heightened mistrust of both scientists and the media. So, as you point out, the worst thing you could do was to pretend that news is an exact science or that science is an exact science. As I point out on this show all the time, that's why they publish their findings and their studies in peer-reviewed publications, so they can try to knock them down and try to find the holes in them and find out where they're wrong. That's how science works, and that's not how people are operating since Trump. People are operating that if you do science and you question science, which is what science does all the time to science, you're somehow a crazy Trumper, you're a right-winger, and you need to be canceled. And that's what you're laying out here.
Yeah, part of this is, I think, just journalists are uneducated and they don't really know what science is. I mean, I don't have scientific training, but I've talked to enough of them to know that science is not a set of facts and dictums. It's a method. It's a process. And scientists, I've heard from so many scientists since COVID started, who are just frustrated with the way the story has been reported because things change. People, you find things out over the course of treating a disease, or new data comes in. Maybe ventilators don't work. Maybe they're not necessary. Maybe everybody doesn't need to be intubated immediately. Like, these are things that you learn over time. But what they were doing is they were taking slivers of consensus opinion at snapshot moments at every stage of this controversy and declaring it sort of an immutable fact. And if you were on the wrong side of it, you were crazy, or you were a right winger, or you were a conspiracy theorist. And worse than that, they were getting people knocked off the internet for this. I mean, this was either career ruining, or it was a real problem, and it was a total misunderstanding of how all this works. Science is a conversation. And they cut off the conversation at the most crucial junction that we've probably had in modern history.
Yeah, when we should have been having the most robust debates possible, we were having none. Debate was then shamed as bad and toxic. So I just want to, here's how you close out. You say this, you go, fact checking was a huge boon when it was an out of sight process, quietly polishing the turd of industrial reportage. When companies dragged it out in public and made it a beast of burden for use in impressing audiences, they defamed their tradition. So explain, what do you mean by that? When it was an out of sight process as to now? Talk about that transformation.
So again, the news happens in a blink of an eye, right? Like, most of the time you're reporting a story and it's got to be like in print within 5 hours in a daily news operation. A fact checker is just there to make sure you don't make the most obvious screw up, like that you don't get sued, that you don't spell somebody's name with 2 letters off, that you don't have the year off by 6 years, whatever it is. They're there to keep the journalists, typically, and most importantly, like in broadcast journalism, keep them from looking too stupid. Because the reality is we know almost nothing about almost anything we report, and we're just getting the basics to you as quickly as possible. Fact checkers had a really important job, which was to steer us away from the kind of obvious big rocks in the sea that we could have shipwrecked on when we're doing this kind of work. But instead of people understanding that it's just kind of a last-ditch protective mechanism for journalists, they dragged it out and made it this kind of ennobled thing, like that there were these sort of faultless finders of the truth, which is totally not their job. They're great at what they do, in my experience, but that's not what they do. They're not there to find the truth. They're there to save our asses, and they've misrepresented what fact-checking is to the public.
And let me just end with this. It says, we know only a few things absolutely for sure, like the spelling of femur or Blaine Gabbert's career interception total. The public knows pretty much everything else is up for argument. So we only look like jerks pretending we can fact check the universe. We do better admitting we don't know. That would be such a refreshing turn, Matt, if you tuned in and heard Wolf Blitzer tell the truth, which is he doesn't know. I don't know what happened in Syria. I'm not on the ground. I don't know what's happening in Libya. I don't know what's happening in Venezuela. I don't know what's happening with the COVID virus. I don't know we don't know. None of this stuff is known, and it's going to take years for science to settle on this. And so right now, let's not shame anybody for questioning things and having ideas, because that's what the strength of a democracy is a robust debate. And that's what we're supposed to be having. And that's the strength of science, by the way, is a robust debate, and you try to knock it down. And that's, anyway,
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
You're trying. So I just wanted to go, so this is what I first noticed this when this story broke, right? So the CDC abruptly changed its guidance on face masks. And abruptly, right? And it makes sense, right? So like, if you're vaccinated and the vaccine works, why would I need to wear a frickin' mask? And if you are not vaccinated, and you are worried about catching COVID, then go get fucking vaccinated. Don't tell me to wear a mask after I'm vaccinated. That means you don't believe the science that vaccines work. That's
right.
And the CDC realized that, I think. They realized that the pace of vaccines was too slow to get herd immunity, and that because idiot Fauci was walking around after he had been double vaxxed with 2 fucking masks on, which was completely performative theater. And now the CDC is saying that's stupid. Stop doing that. If you're vaccinated, you don't have to frickin' wear a mask. That's what the CDC. But guess what? Now it's okay to disagree with the CDC. Now you can disagree with them. So here it is right here. In a break with the CDC's new guidelines, California is going to keep its mask mandate. So they're saying they don't trust the science on vaccines. Why is that okay now, Matt?
Look, there's obviously, again, this is cultural and political. I mean, Joe Biden was having himself photographed wearing masks when he was doing Zoom calls. Kamala Harris was doing the same thing. She's in a room full of people who have been vaccinated. There's absolutely no reason. The CDC guidelines say that you don't have to do that. And these are the 2 most visible politicians in the country are essentially going against the CDC guidelines, which tells you what exactly? They don't think the vaccines work. They don't trust the CDC. Like, what's the point of that? I think it's mostly just kind of cultural virtue signaling, and it's a little, to me, like almost cultish behavior. But it's just weird how how reporters throughout this entire time, they dove into this mask issue with such fervor, and it was like the torch-bearing mob in Frankenstein or something. Anybody who had any kind of divergent opinion about it, had to be publicly shamed. Whereas, I think there were legitimate differences of opinion and shades of differences about what kind of mask use was permissible or safe in different circumstances. But they just wanted to have everybody wearing a mask all the time, and that was the only way they wanted to report the issue, which was just so weird.
I just want to remind people, because it's not hyperbole when I say that Dr. Fauci's been lying about this all along. He lied about the herd immunity. He said at first it would take 60% of people to get vaccinated before we would have herd immunity. And then when the polls changed and said more people would be willing to get vaccine, he changed that number. He moved it up to 70 to 85% to 90%. And then when asked why he did that, he said, well, because the polls said that people were more receptive. So he's giving you false information because he doesn't think that the polls will handle it well. That's not how science is supposed to work. That's not how medicine works. And I'm not making that up. He admitted that he did that. I'm not accusing him of doing that. He's admitted he did that. And there's been no consequences for him. And there's been almost zero reporting of it. And I'll show you another thing there's been almost zero reporting of. Here he is being asked about, should we wear masks on 60 Minutes?
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course. But when you...
Schmutz, we're talking science. So now here he is admitting why he did that. So he was giving incorrect medical advice to everyone in America. So now what that means is there are a lot of people who didn't wear a mask, who got COVID and maybe died and maybe got sick for the rest of their life because they were following his incorrect advice. And he was lying then. He wasn't giving you misinformation. He wasn't wrong. He was lying and misleading you on purpose. He was putting your health at risk. And why? Here's why.
So you shouldn't discount that. Now, getting back to your first question, which was what about a month or so or 2 or 3 ago when people were saying you don't really need to wear a mask? Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected. We did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed.
So he just admitted that I lied and I told people to what they did was then reckless. And I lied. Why? Because I needed to protect these other people's lives that were more important than your life. But now you can trust me going forward because we have enough masks. Now you can trust that I'll always tell you the truth, except if I feel like your life isn't as important as someone else's life, then I'm going to lie to you again, just like he did with herd immunity. So it looks like he's lying about gain of function. That he funded it. Looked like he lied about that. He was funding gain of function. It looks like he was, and then he lied about it because when he's in front of the Congress and he's asked questions, he sounds like a politician. He doesn't sound like a doctor. So there he is lying, and there he is. How does he get away with that, Matt?
Well, again, it's funny because Fauci was one of the guests at Poynter's Festival of Fact Checking.
Yes,
and I think there's a very good reason for that, which is that for a lot of people in blue state America, Fauci was the symbol of kind of anti-Trumpism. He was the counter to Trump throughout the beginning of the COVID disaster. And people looked to him as kind of like the soul of rectitude on television. He was the figure that they trusted on television, who was not Trump, right? And so I understand that to a degree, but the problem for journalists became they now refused to criticize him at all because they didn't want to be perceived as being pro-Trump or doing anything that would have been looking like a Trumpian criticism. So now he's immune from the criticism that he should have gotten, or maybe should have gotten in certain cases, because he's a symbol of something politically, which again is not how you're supposed to do the job. It should be separate from those considerations.
Matt, I was at dinner the other night, and I had a grown-up person who I respect say to me, well, what was Fauci supposed to do? I don't know when you think lying to people about the medical advice is ever right. That what you're supposed to do is, I don't know, tell people how to make their own masks, tell people to stay home, tell people to, you don't lie to them about the science of medicine on purpose and endanger their lives, which is what he did.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of other things that you could say, look, we have a difficult situation. We have to triage these masks, right? So we're not going to tell you that it's safe to go outside without a mask. Take that into consideration, but you might not be able to get one right now. We're gonna prioritize giving them to healthcare workers. Why not say that? I mean, that's better than lying and being caught doing it later, unless you have a press that doesn't ask you questions about it, which is kind of where we are right now.
When I tried to buy masks, N95 masks on Amazon, they said you can't buy them. We're reserving these for frontline workers. Okay, why couldn't they do that? Why don't you go out and hold a press conference and say the president should command the corporations and industry to make more masks? You can do that. He could do an executive order and make people do whatever he wants to. He could have done that. He could have ordered them to make ventilators. He could have ordered them to make masks. That's what Fauci should have been doing. He should have been telling us the truth, not lying to us about our healthcare and science. And somehow that gets turned into a virtue. They take that and they turn it into he was trying to protect people. I mean, the way liberals' minds work is just mind-blowing to me. Like, well, what else was he supposed to do? Now, how could you ever trust that guy?
Exactly. And again, people they're mixing something up. They're trying to express the fact that they don't like Donald Trump through their boundless faith in this other individual, whereas the two things are actually totally separate issues. They should be looking at them as completely separate narratives, completely separate stories, and judging them individually. And that's a problem we've had throughout the Trump period, like with the Russiagate story. Like, they don't look at that objectively as a separate set of facts. They see it as a Trump story. And so clearly, X must be true because Trump is bad. And it's the same thing that happened with Fauci. He's gotten a pass on a lot of things, because he's perceived as being, politically on a certain side.
And again, the Russiagating, the McCarthy smearing, that became, all the rage in liberal quarters and even on YouTube. that's really destructive. I don't know how I tried to tell people at the Young Turks when I worked there, this is really destructive. What you're doing is actually going to hurt the left more than it hurts Donald Trump. And it's going to hurt just our culture. And they couldn't give a shit. They don't care. And so here we are. Hey, everybody, this is the part where I tell you where all our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then this is why I tell you to join our premium program and get extra content, but nobody's got a fucking job. So just enjoy the video.